Thanks for coming, everybody. As always, the management requests that you drink as much beer as you can and you finish every beer that you start so that he doesn't have to pour it down the drain. My friend Stuart, who's here, I think for every trip, right, told me something very interesting a few weeks ago. His visits. He told his father, who's now 96. I thought it was 96, but I didn't want to overestimate. That he was coming out to Bushwick to see a gallery show of our friend Matt, and his father said, "Oh, that's where I grew up." Now, you knew that? You didn't know that? Didn't know that at all. So the father's 96, so this means about 90 years ago, that would be about 1925, he lived on Barrack Street, is that right? Barrack Street, and it was a Jewish neighborhood, and it was filled with push carts. So many that apparently in the Hebrew sections of the neighborhood it was considered a problem. And well, yes, and your grandfather was a pushcart peddler, and he sold to Italian clientele, so he actually spoke better Italian than English as a second language after Hebrew. Yes. I'm working without a net here. There's a wonderful picture, actually, of LaGuardia opening up an indoor, sort of indoor shopping area to try and get the vendors off of the streets. I think it's still there, but it made me think about this neighborhood filled with a bunch of immigrants from probably Ukraine, Poland, Belarus. The first generation Jews needed a synagogue. I live in a synagogue up the hill. It's about a mile away. It was also started by merchants in the area. It's probably too far away for the people who live down here to comfortably walk on the Sabbath, but it's possible. We walk it all the time, but we're not under pressure. I'll go into more detail about the history of that synagogue in next week, I think. But what was interesting about the experience of buying the synagogue was that it was occupied at the time by almost no one except a rabbi from the Lubavitcher sect. And he did not want this synagogue sold to a bunch of artists. And he brought a lawsuit against the congregation, which went to trial. And I was a witness in this trial. And what was one of the most memorable moments in the trial is when the rabbi and his lawyer came into the courtroom in Queens with a briefcase. Their briefcases had a picture of Rabbi Schneerson, their Messiah rabbi, duct taped to their briefcases. And we realized that we were in for an experience with a kind of obsessive religion that I, in my secular past, wasn't so familiar with, although I did have a strange precedent. When I was a boy living in Chicago, in Hyde Park, some of you will know this, no doubt, I went to a period, which I have spoken about before, of sort of obsessive religiosity of my own, but it was a self-invented religion. Late at night, I would begin to pray to an all-powerful God not to kill me in the night. And it occurred to me every night when I made this prayer that an all-powerful, perhaps a merciless God would not appreciate being taken for granted. So every night the prayer had to be more elaborate and more obsequious than the night before to prove that I wasn't taking anything for granted and that I would not be running the risk of being smitten or smited overnight. And this went on for some time until there was a psychiatric intervention on the part of my father saying, well, I'll go into that detail later on. But this did give me some insight into, I think, what was going on in the heads of these people. We'll get back to that later. I want to get back to the idea of this walk from this area to the hill, because it occurred to me as I was trying to put these ideas together that there was another walk in my life in Hyde Park that was extremely important. One day, my mother read about a ceramics class for children opening at the Hyde Park Art Center, which was across town, across the neighborhood. And she didn't have time to take me or my brother. We were about 7 or 8 years old. So she got Peter Hoshino, our neighbor, to walk us there. This is not something you would do anymore. This is not a neighborhood that little boys were supposed to walk through necessarily, but we got there. I met this wonderful woman named Dorothy Horton, who was a professional ceramicist, and I worked with her for years and years, learning how to make clay pots and little figurines that I became increasingly obsessed with. She was probably the first artisan I met. The first artist I met was at Ebony magazine. There was a girl in our school named Mimi Poinsett. A lot of the kids in our school, parents worked at Ebony and Jet magazine. And we would take our school trips to see how newspapers and magazines were made to Ebony and Jet. And we would go into the offices and see there was I guess he was the staff illustrator who sat behind this enormous drafting table and easel. I didn't realize that you could draw on a slant until I saw how this worked. And he had, piles and piles of pencils and light, and he described to the students how you made art. And so these two figures, the ceramicist and the illustrator for Ebony magazine, were my first models for how to make art. It took me a long time to put all of these ideas together, the drawing and the object making. I went through a period of trying to draw our cartoon strips, which were in fact kind of constructions, and one that seems to pull all those threads, including the obsessive religion, together was a drawing I made not long after called The Adventures of Your Finger, and it was a series of drawings that you could actually assemble. And this was, your finger is either the center of the universe or your finger is worshipped by tiny natives. So there was a picture of people. This is going to be a hard thing. So you stick your finger through the drawing, and then you're the object of idol worship by a bunch of tiny. Depending on the angle, it was very satisfying. But I was having a lot of trouble when I was drawing this cartoon strip, trying to sort of reconcile it to all the other work I was doing in studios. And then one day, as this often happens, something very simple occurs where you realize that there's a kind of a confluence of circumstances that allow you to move forward. There was a show at the Rotunda Gallery, I think I was just talking to somebody about that today, for sculptors who perform. I didn't perform, but my friend Daniel said, do you know anything about lightning sketches? And lightning sketches were a vaudeville routine where somebody would talk and draw at the same time. Sometimes they were very prosaic, like they'd be talking about the gold standard or prohibition or suffrage, and people would listen and watch, and it was sort of like a magic act a little bit. It's like things coming out of nowhere into something. But mostly they were sort of minstrel shows, and there were sort of lots of trick drawings, like a mountain that would turn into a house, and the house would turn into a bicycle, and the bicycle would have a rider, and then something else would happen. And Winsor McKay, who did the beautiful, I can't even remember. Little Nemo, yeah. But he also did Gertie the dinosaur. It's like one of the first beautifully animated dinosaurs. This dinosaur walks around eating things. And he could draw like a bat out of hell. Every line he made was always perfect, and it's a wonderful little video where he makes, oh, not a video, it's a film, it's like 10,000 drawings of Gertie the dinosaur walking around. I was so interested in this history, and I was so happy that there might be a way of performing when you didn't actually have to do anything original. I went down to Washington, D.C. to see, it turns out that Harry Houdini, of all people, had collected the world's most complete list of how-to books for lightning sketches. He was sort of a connoisseur of all things vaudevillian, it turns out. And at the Library of Congress, there's a bunch of little books that like paper, they're falling apart. They're made on very cheap paper. You put on white gloves, and they have this beautiful red velvet kind of holder, and you put on these gloves, and then they bring in this teeny little piece of newsprint. And as I turned the pages were cracking. But they're very specific about how to do sorts of conversions, like you draw a potted plant, and then you turn it upside down, and it's like George Bernard Shaw. But what's most interesting about these is how unabashedly objectionable most of the jokes they had in them. There'd be, you would write, say, the other day I was walking down the street and I saw my friend Cohen, and very quickly this drawing turns into this fairly racist depiction of a Jewish man. Or I was having a wonderful meal of ham when Mr. Cohen's wife, Elsie, came down the street, and she was wearing an elaborate hat. And see how the ham turns into Mrs. Cohen's hat. But there were a number of other drawings like that were very clever, but I never quite, I never kind of owned up to until now. There was in particular, a story that I kept telling about my beautiful Aunt Lulu, who wore big hats with lots of ribbons, and she had beautiful hair, enormous eyes, and a little beasting mouth and a long, thin neck. And everybody thought that she should be a model or an actress until she ran away and joined the circus. She became a clown. It's very funny, but this is not in fact what the story was. The real story, which was much funnier to them, is that she turned into a black-faced minstrel. And it was such the idea that, it was not just Jews and blacks who were caricatured, it was Scots people and Irishmen and Dutchmen. And it was like a complete free-for-all of sort of prejudice and humiliation. But it seemed to be a kind of acceptable dialogue of the time. And it was kind of interesting to try to figure out how you could possibly translate that material into present discourse, and I couldn't do it. I basically started making up other stories, but I still would like this. None of this stuff has ever been performed, and probably it should never be. But it's part of another larger tradition of sort of drawings that function as mechanisms for kind of a certain kind of surprise. And one in particular that I was very struck by, I first heard about from my friend Sina, who showed me pictures from the Arab photographic library. And they were very fond of these photographs where people would pose in these sort of exotic backdrops, like a whole family sitting behind a picture of an airplane flying over the sea. And it's it's sort of a studio trick, and nobody's buying it, but it was so exotic, and everybody looked so happy to be sitting in this giant airplane that I was quite struck by it and looked into this. And it turns out these are normally called comic forefronts. And in fact, sometime in 1860, I think, no, it would have to be a little bit later, but 1870 or so, there was a patent taken out on comic forefronts. I actually remember, at least for the day, that it was patent number 149,224. Can I get that right? And this is how it works. It was called a patent for photographic process. And basically, it was a piece of cardboard, and on the cardboard would be a drawing, say, of a man with a fishing rod, and he'd be sitting on a porch, and so here's a fish, you see the fish, here's the man's head. You don't see the head because I'm now the man fishing. And this actually got a patent number 149,724, and you could do any kind of, you could be like I could be a mermaid, and they were very popular. I don't know how the hell they got a patent to work on this, but Coolidge, the man who invented it, was named Cassius Marcellus Coolidge, and he was a very resourceful character, sort of a self-taught artist. He is most famous for a series of paintings he did around 1900 for I think it was a cigar company, of dogs playing poker. The famous dogs playing poker pictures were all invented by Cassius Marcellus Coolidge. He ended up living in Brooklyn, I think. He died in the 30s. And I was struck by the name, Cassius Marcellus Coolidge, which is not an ordinary name, but it might be echoes of something familiar about it. Turns out he was the son of Quakers, and they had named him after a famous mid-century American named Cassius Marcellus Clay. Cassius Marcellus Clay was from the famous and powerful Clay family of Kentucky. He was a cousin of Henry Clay, the great compromise senator. His father, Green Clay, started the family fortune, I think. What was interesting about Cassius Marcellus Clay, even though he came from this wealthy family who was dedicated to the preservation of the Old South, is that he was a fervent abolitionist, a violent abolitionist, in fact. He went to Yale, and he heard Garrison give a speech there, and he said it was like water to a thirsty man. He became the cause of his life, although he had many causes. And from about 1840 on, he became very involved in publishing and advocating for abolition of slavery. He was a tough guy. His favorite method of persuasion was a Bowie knife, and he would often get into fights in the crowds with angry Southerners and have to defend himself with his knife. He killed a few people, he got stabbed a few times. He actually had on his house a cannon to protect himself and his family. He had a big family, and he lived, I think, in Charleston, Kentucky. He had a big house called Whitechapel, I think. And he became friendly with Lincoln, and he pushed Lincoln to sign an Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had actually made him the envoy to first Spain and then Russia during the Civil War. He wanted to be fighting, but Lincoln wanted him in Russia. And he actually was in 1862 when the first manifesto emancipating the serfs in Russia was signed. He was there, and there seems to be some indication that he came back to the States. He was trying to push Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. He lived a long life. He became increasingly eccentric and crazy at the end of his life. After about 45 years, he divorced his wife, who'd been running the family for all these years, and he took up with a 15-year-old girl about 70 years younger than him, and he tried to charge his wife rent for raising the family in the house after the divorce. And it was such an awful situation that several of his daughters became powerful, ardent suffragettes. In fact, his daughter Laura Clay, in 1920, became the first woman ever nominated for the presidency by a major party. She was a Democratic nominee for president in the convention of 1920. But at the end of his life, Clay was, there's a newspaper article, at 91 he was shooting his guns off at people on his property, and I think they were hoping to he was sort of a local embarrassment, but a very interesting character. And his name, Coolidge wasn't the only person named after him. As some of you might have already surmised, he was the man who Cassius Marcellus Clay Sr. was named after. Cassius Marcellus Sr. was a house painter in Louisville, Kentucky, and he named his son Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. He became the boxing champion of the world, and then changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali moved to Hyde Park in about 1970, where I lived. He moved there to follow a man named Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad was the second leader after Fard Muhammad of the Black Muslim movement in the United States. Elijah Muhammad was part of the first diaspora of southern blacks to leave. He came from Georgia. He went to Detroit trying to find a better job. As a young man, he'd seen several lynchings in Georgia, and he said he'd had enough white racism to last 26,000 lifetimes or something. He goes to Detroit. He starts this, he falls in with Fard Muhammad, this black nationalist movement. He ends up taking over when Fard disappears mysteriously. He moves to Chicago, and he moves to Hyde Park. He's part of a number of entrepreneurs who moved to that area, black entrepreneurs, part of that diaspora. John Johnson, who started Ebony magazine and Jet magazine, is also in that area. So Muhammad Ali is now our neighbor. He's a much better neighbor than Elijah Muhammad, who posts his bodyguards, the Fruits of Islam, all over the neighborhood, and they terrorize all the kids who walk by the houses. If you throw a snowball in the area, you get chased down the block. But Muhammad Ali was this wonderfully charismatic character. I remember him driving slowly through Hyde Park in a golden Rolls Royce with a beautiful woman, I think his wife, in the seat next to him. And he was driving by our synagogue on Greenwood, of all places. He passed a garbage truck, and the garbage man jumps out of the garbage truck, and he races down the street. Ali is driving this car about 5 miles an hour. I said, "Muhammad, you can't run by me." And Muhammad stops, he puts his hand up, he shakes his hand, and the guy runs back to the garbage truck. It was like the most graceful demonstration of nobility I've ever seen. I had one encounter with Ali myself. I was walking down the street with my sister, past his house, big house set back from the road, and he came out with 2 or 3 handlers to get into a car, and he walks right in front of us. And so I say, "Hiya, champ." And he stops, and he says, "Do you call me chump? Do you call me chump?" And he starts running forward, and his handlers grab him by the arm and said, no, champ. He called you champ. He goes, "You called me chump, didn't you?" And I said, no, I called you champ. And they get in the car, and then they drive away, and they realize that was probably at least as graceful a gesture as he'd done with the garbage man. He went into his Joe Frazier routine with a kid on the street. He knew exactly what I said, but he knew it was a much better story if he said, "You call me chump." My own family's diaspora story is not nearly as distinguished as Johnson or Elijah Muhammad's. In fact, we didn't really know where our families came from. My mother's side was Polish and German. My father's side had been Russian, I guess, and they'd come much later, around 1900, I think. And it was the kind of family where we said, "What was it like?" And they'd say, "Don't ask. It's better here." And the only comment my grandfather ever said is like one day, on Christmas Day down at Miami Beach, somebody said to Grandpa Sam, "Merry Christmas." And nothing got Grandpa up very much, but he heard that and he jumped up and he said, "Merry Christmas? How can you say Christmas? Thousands of Jews were murdered on Christmas." And I didn't, and then everybody said, Sam, calm down." And I think what he was referring to is that there were, in fact, pogroms regularly scheduled on Christian holidays that got people mad about what the Jews were doing to them. But a generation or two later, as not infrequently happens, there's a lot more curiosity about what the old country was like. And I think my Uncle Meyer went looking around and found some relatives, and then my cousin Michael went back, and he found the town that my family was from. And it was sort of a good news, bad news story. And we found the town. That's the good news. The bad news is the town's called Dog Shits, which is true. And I said, "No, it looks like dog shits, but you have to pronounce it dog shitsy." But that really didn't fool anybody. And it felt the idea of coming from a town called Dog Shits is so appealingly awful that it became my favorite diaspora story of all time. You think you have it bad, you didn't come from Dog Shits. Dog Shits is like somewhere between, it's called the Pale. It used to be Poland, and then it was Germany, then it was Russia. Now it's officially Belarus. And the cousin who found it found the rolls, and you can see I never thought Freedman was a particularly Russian-sounding name, but apparently it is. There were Freedmans and all these other families, and as you might expect, sometime around 1942, there was 2,800 people in the town, and everybody who stayed was murdered by the Nazis. And they took them to the edge of, I think it was on Passover. They shot them, as many as they could. I think there were a couple dozen survivors, but it made me hungry for an idea of some kind of distinguished ancestor. You couldn't really invent one in Dog Shits. And when I found out, actually in this room, I think it was in an opening a couple of years ago, somebody said that they were going to an art opening in the Bronx at the Andrew Freedman House. And it was now and I didn't know it. And the guy, when I said, "What's the Andrew Freedman House?" And it's Freedman with two E's, which is the proper way to spell it, but the unusual way to spell it. And they said, "You don't know about the Andrew Freedman House?" And it went into such a story. Andrew Freedman was a kind of a 19th century New York Jewish robber baron of uncertain ancestry. I think he was German, and nobody knows quite where he came from or how he made his money, but sometime in the 1880s, as a fairly young man, he became a financier for Tammany Hall, the corrupt politicians. And he was very involved in a lot of interesting things. He's considered one of the four. I mean, he invested in the subway system at 1900. So he was, in his obituaries, they mentioned that as one of his achievements. He was on the board of the Wright Brothers Corporation, helping them build planes. He also, for a couple of years, owned the New York Giants baseball team, which sort of made him the George Steinbrenner of his day. But he was he was the most hated man in baseball. He was kind of an autocrat, and he feuded with all his players, most notably Amos Russi, known as the Hoosier Thunderbolt, because he wrote a book called, I think it's called Amos Russi, the Hoosier Thunderbolt, and how he obtained such fantastic speed on his thrown ball. Which is not what you would call a book now, but he was a big guy. He could throw the ball very fast. He made about $2,500 a year, and he held out for a better contract. He was the best pitcher in baseball. And Freedman fined him $200. And they were both so stubborn that this guy sat out the entire year over this $200 fine that he refused to pay. And in fact, I think the other owners finally got Freedman to leave the team, to leave baseball and go into other things. And that's where the Andrew Freedman home comes into play. Andrew Freedman, in about 1914, there was a panic and he almost lost all his money. And when he survived this, but he saw some of his friends lose their money, he had an amazing insight, which is that his life would really suck if he didn't have all the money that he was used to. That, in fact, the kind of genteel and pleasant, highly cultured life that he had grown accustomed to would be a lot more difficult to leave behind than if he'd never known the sort of pleasures of the high life. And this gave him a notion that maybe that was the greatest tragedy of all. Poverty amongst poor people was one thing, but poverty amongst rich people was something far worse. And that he decided he would leave his money to wealthy and cultured people who lost their fortunes so that they could continue to live in the manner to which they had grown accustomed and to which they deserved to live. And it was a kind of extraordinary idea. And he died before he could realize it. But his sister and his mother persevered, and they invested most of his $5 million fortune in building this home. It's on the Grand Concourse up in the Bronx. It's this Italianate pavilion. It was, I think, finally finished in the 1920s or so, and it was in fact designed to be for people who could prove that they'd once been wealthy, but also that they were sophisticated. The articles of the time are very funny. It says, if you were rich as Croesus and are now as poor as Job's turkey, this is the home for you. And then it goes into all the criteria that they tried to establish to make it possible that they could sort of discriminate between those who deserved to be in this home and those who didn't. Interestingly, it had no criteria about creed or race or marital status. It turns out that old age homes or homes for the indigent always would routinely separate couples back then. They were always for men or women, but this would allow you to stay there. And there were butlers, there were tickets to the opera. You couldn't put your feet on the sofa, I think. There were some rules of behavior. And they had a little bit of trouble finding people until the great crash of 1929, which supplied them with a lot of previously cultured but impoverished people for a couple of decades. But it was not well run, and it ran out of money sometime in the 60s or 70s and became a kind of a routine. They began charging rent. There's a beautiful article about after the war, a lot of refugees from the Holocaust came over and they lived there, so it became a sort of place for doctors and lawyers to live, sort of a Jewish retirement home. And then it sort of fell apart. Now it's an art center. That's, I think that's maybe that's the ultimate retirement home. It's been turned into some kind of space where you can go do. I saw some installations there which were very interesting, but didn't really capture this strange history of this place. Back to Amos Brucey for a second, the baseball player that Andrew Freedman kept out of baseball. In about 1890, he was the greatest pitcher in the world, but he hurt his arm apparently, and only played a few more years. Otherwise, he might be as well known now as a man named Cy Young. Cy Young was also named after or nicknamed after a weather situation. He was known as Cyclone. His name was Denton True Young, but he was called Cy Young because he also could throw the ball very fast as a Cyclone. And he pitched for many teams for years and years and years. He ended up winning 511 games, which nobody will ever match because nobody pitches that much anymore. He grew too fat to continue to play baseball, but his rubber arm never failed him, according to legend. I think he ended up as a handyman on a farm someplace. But there was a period when every baseball player, every pitcher who was worth his salt, who could throw the ball, the speed ball fast, was nicknamed Cy, including a pitcher who played for the Chicago White Sox, the team that I rooted for as a kid, but around 1920. He played for 1 year, and then he retired to be a coach. And his name was Cy Twombly. And this is the only crowd where that would get a bigger laugh than Cy Twombly had a son named Cy Twombly. And that is the Cy Twombly that we know and love. Cy Twombly, the painter, actually had another son named Cy too, but he cheated and called him Cyrus or something, Cyrus Alessandro. But Cy Twombly, the painter, is not the son you would expect to have from this this jock dad, but I don't know how they got along. But Cy, went to the Black Mountain School, and he went off. He became an interesting painter, but his career changed irrevocably in the early 50s when he was drafted in the Army, and he became part of the cryptography service. And he came out making the sort of distinctive marks that we know him for now, which you could argue he reduced the mark to a language to these letters, this sort of looping E, which is sort of a reduction of a sentence to a word to a letter to which there can be no further reduction except these marks. There's, of course, he's a very controversial figure about whether or not, the sort of traditional question of could my kid do that when you see something like this. There's a really interesting essay by Roland Barthes, actually, describing how difficult it is to actually draw like a kid, and that, kids draw it's very difficult to try to sort of, the way a child draws is to imitate reality, and these Twombly drawings are so far from the gestures are sort of pure form, but also this sort of reduction of content into a gesture creates these sort of enigmatic, poetic marks that apparently only other artists can love. Interestingly, he's not the only baseball player or anyone related to baseball who is interested in codes. There was another baseball player named Moe Berg who also played for the Chicago White Sox. He's from New York, but he ended up going to Princeton. And he was a shortstop, but he became a catcher. And among other things, he could speak 9 languages. But as one of his fellow baseball players said, he could speak 9 languages, but he couldn't hit in any of them. He was a pretty terrible baseball player, but he somehow stayed in the big leagues for about 15 years. He was a good defensive player. And he was included on many of the overseas tours that they used to go on after in the off season. They didn't make as much money back then. And there were several tours that went to Japan in the 1930s. And here's this guy who could barely hit his weight going to Japan with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And they would play the game, and then he would go sightseeing. And he would go, one year he went to the Tokyo hospital to see the daughter of the ambassador, the American ambassador who was in the hospital. But he really didn't see her. He went to the roof of the hospital, which was the tallest building in Tokyo at the time, and he took pictures of the city. And then he toured through Asia. And it turned out that Moberg wasn't just a bad baseball player, he was a spy. And he was working for the OSS. After the war began, he showed these images to the American command, and they were used to direct Jimmy Doolittle in his first raid. After Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of pressure to have a kind of a revenge attack directly on Japan. And just a few months later, a flight of B-25 Mitchell bombers flew over Tokyo using apparently Moberg's directions to bomb the city. Berg had other adventures during the war. He was in Europe evaluating for the OSS the resistance movements. He met Tito in Yugoslavia and decided he was the strongest person to back. He was sent to Zurich to attend a lecture by Heisenberg, and he was given a gun. Heisenberg was supposed to talk about the progress of the atomic bomb. And if he thought Heisenberg was indicating that they were close to creating a functioning atom bomb in Germany, he was to pull out the gun and shoot him. And he decided that they weren't close to making the bomb, so he didn't shoot him. It would have been a more interesting end to Berg's life. After the war, he became increasingly eccentric, and he refused to take any jobs. He wanted to be sent to Israel, but they wouldn't send him to Israel. I think he ended up living with his sister and collecting bus tokens or something like that. And he refused to write his life story. So we don't really know exactly what he did. I think he sort of exaggerated things as much as he could for effect. On the south side of Chicago, where I was living, we were within a couple of blocks, well, I say more than a couple blocks, but close enough to the stadium where Moberg played baseball, Comiskey Park, which was named after another horrible owner, probably worse than Andrew Freedman, Charles Comiskey, who cheated his players out of money, and that's why the Black Sox scandal began. But our house was close enough to the stadium that whenever, which happened very rarely, the White Sox would hit a home run, these fireworks would go off and this exploding scoreboard that Bill Beck, their eccentric owner, had created. Bill Beck was an interesting character. He had actually integrated baseball, the American League, a few months after Jackie Robinson became a Brooklyn Dodger. Larry Doby began playing for the Cleveland Indians, who he owned at the time. The White Sox, as it turned out, had a chance to have Jackie Robinson play for them in 1942, 5 years before he made the major leagues. He tried out for the Chicago White Sox. They agreed that he was good enough to be a major leaguer, but they lacked the courage to sign him. The manager wouldn't even pose with him. So he went back to UCLA and then the Army, and then he later became a baseball player in the National League. But it's probably just as well for him he didn't end up in Chicago at that time, which was about as segregated and racist a city as you can imagine. The Hyde Park, where we lived, was relatively integrated. That's where all the black baseball players, even if they played Ernie Banks, the great Chicago Mr. Cub, couldn't live near the stadium on the north side because it was completely segregated up there. But Hyde Park, as I was saying, with Elijah Muhammad, and all the black entrepreneurs had a kind of inverted sort of social system of white academics and black entrepreneurs. The synagogue that I was describing earlier, that I attended, KAM Isaiah Israel, 3 synagogues that have this, that began in different parts of the city. KAM is I think Hebrew for Men of the West, the first synagogue west of Cincinnati, again 1847 in a small town, and that was later built into this enormous edifice designed by Louis Sullivan, the great architect, to look sort of like a pyramid on top of this monolith. He didn't believe in spires. And this existed in Midtown for a long time, and as demographic forces shifted the same way we ended up in our synagogue, they moved out, and this became the Pilgrim Baptist Church, which was actually the birthplace of gospel music. Mahalia Jackson sang there. Jack Johnson, the great boxer, the precursor to Muhammad Ali as the first black heavyweight champion, his funeral was there. It burned down a few years ago because I think they couldn't afford to build this pyramid the way Sullivan liked it on the top, so it became wood, and then eventually it caught fire and the whole thing burned down. The other 2 synagogues, the Isaiah Synagogue and Israel Synagogue, when I first moved to Chicago, my family did in the early 60s, halfway between Comiskey Park and our home was this Greek Revival building that was the home of Temple Israel. I think I only went there a few times before it closed down, and they combined with KAM to make KAM Isaiah Israel, which was this Moorish building with a minaret and a dome and on Greenwood Avenue. And they abandoned the Greek Revival home. It was actually bought by Mahalia Jackson and given to Jesse Jackson and became the home of Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity. And many years later, after I had avoided getting a bar mitzvah because my grandfather, Sam, had a stroke and nobody just thought it was worth having a bar mitzvah if Grandpa had a stroke and didn't know what was going on, I had to go to KAM Isaiah Israel and have a, what is it that they call it now? It was like a very low, it was a low-grade religious conversion experience, but it was supposed to be sort of an intellectual as opposed to a ritual envelopment into culture. But unfortunately, having to attend all of the services in this temple reminded me so much of my obsessive prayers as a young person that I lost whatever degree of faith I had, because all the prayers that the rabbis were offering up to God sounded suspiciously like the same obsequious pleas that I had invented as a 5-year-old. But there was one interesting event that happened. On Saturday mornings after services, one day, we were told that Jesse Jackson, our neighbor at the Operation Push building, was going to come and visit the community and give a talk. So sure enough, at the end of services, which are now populated not just by little annoyed Jewish kids and some older Jewish parents, but his congregation, Jackson comes and he gives a talk, and he's going to address us. The rabbi who I didn't like very much, introduces Jackson. And before he introduces Jackson, he says, we're very honored to have Reverend Jackson here. I'd like to just to say what a proud tradition this congregation has with the civil rights movement. I marched with Martin and Selma. I was at the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Jesse Jackson. And then Jackson gets up and he says, Martin Luther King is dead and I'm alive. And the poor Rabbi Maslin goes back and he sits in his chair, steaming, and Jackson proceeds to give his talk. I can't even remember what the talk was about, but at the end of the talk, he says, now I'd be happy to answer questions from the audience, if you have any. And one by one, people get up and ask questions, and Jackson answers them. And then a black man gets up, and he says, I have a question. And Jackson says, well, brother, we have a lot of time to talk. This is, a time for us to have a conversation with our Jewish cousins, and I'm sure you understand. And the rabbi leaps up with a huge grin on his face, and he says, he is a member of our congregation, which was true. And Jackson, the only time in my life I've ever seen him speechless, he so stares at this man for about 5 seconds, and then he starts laughing, and he says, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. And he falls over on the podium. Just all he can say is, Jesus Christ. And the rabbi had the last laugh. It turns out the guy had some question about parking. I don't know if And I should end there, but it's too much not to say that across the street from KM Isaiah Israel, a young man, a lawyer from the University of Chicago, bought a house a few years later, and that's Barack Obama's house. So, thank you.